It was Evan Gershkovich's first public appearance since his detention 3 weeks ago at a court in Moscow in front of many of his journalist peers who have worked alongside him for years. The Wall Street Journal reporter was denied pre-trial bail. He will have to spend the time until his next hearing in the notorious Lefortovo prison, a symbol of state-sponsored repression since the Soviet era. The Wall Street Journal reporter has been charged with spying following his arrest late last month. Gershkovich and his employer deny any wrongdoing, and Washington is calling for his immediate release. It's the first time a U.S. journalist has been detained on espionage charges by Russia since the end of the Cold War. And we can now speak to William Courtney. He's a senior fellow at the RAND Corporation in Washington, D.C. He's also a former U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia. Mr. Courtney, thank you so much for joining us. Now, Evan Gershkovich is the latest only in a series of foreigners facing what many observers are saying are trumped up or even fake charges. What is your take on what the Russian authorities are doing here?
It certainly is a fake charge, but in the past, this has taken place sometimes when the Russians want to trade a spy. So, for example, Nick Danilov's case in 1986, the previous one in which a journalist was arrested, was designed to give the Soviet Union trading material for a spy.
So you expect to see a prisoner exchange here then? Because there are other U.S. Americans currently held on fake charges that they allege are fake, made-up charges against, for example, Paul Whelan. Do you expect for the authorities to move more quickly on Gershkovich's case here?
Usually the Russian courts take some time, and the Russians typically will not trade someone until after they have been convicted in a Russian court. So it could take some months for this to play out. How the terms of the trade will be, it's not known. There is a spy in Brazil currently who was in the United States in graduate school. It's possible that he could be involved in a trade. It's just unclear at this point.
Now, these kinds of swaps, they are problematic in a way, aren't they? Russia has sold previous prisoner exchanges. The last one, for example, the one with Brittany Griner and Mr. Boot there as an American capitulation. So how should the U.S. government go about these kinds of negotiations?
Well, even back to the Soviet period, there was a question if in a trade, for example, the U.S. received a refusnik or a dissident and gave up a genuine spy. Some people argued that those were unfair trades. In the case of Brittany Griner, she was certainly innocent, but in some respects that was an unfair trade since the Victor Boot, the person who was involved in the trade, was a legendary and notorious international arms dealer. But the politics of these situations vary in the case. And so in Brittany Griner's case, for example, that came out to be quite successful for the United States. Victor Boot had already served almost two-thirds of his sentence anyway.
This is meant, of course, not only to intimidate journalists, but also to pressure Washington to soften its stance on Moscow in a way. Is there a chance it could achieve that goal?
No, no chance whatsoever. Spy swaps usually don't reach that far into genuine political issues. So, for example, Russia's war on Ukraine is a huge issue, and any spy swap will not have any impact on that war.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, because you, of course, have observed Russia for many years, what do you think is going on behind the scenes in the Kremlin? Is there anybody telling Putin, no, this is not a good idea, let's not go down that road, or is everybody just applauding these kinds of decisions?
Well, let's remember the Kremlin is now run by security service, KGB veterans, both Putin himself and his top aides. And so they sometimes are eager to get caught spies, Russian spies who are caught abroad, to get them back, partly because they're concerned that those spies may reveal information to a foreign intelligence service or betray Russia. So in this case, it's hard to know, but it's quite possible that they are concerned to get back a Russian spy.
Just on Monday, opposition activist and fellow journalist Vladimir Kara-Murza was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Do you think suppression of anti-Kremlin voices in Russia could get any worse at this point?
So in 3 decades of modern independence now, Russia has never been more repressive internally than it is now, and never been more aggressive externally than it is now, waging the war. Vladimir has been caught in this. He is a genuine hero, a Russian who really is a patriot, speaking up for freedom in his country. He is caught in this, as is Alexei Navalny. It's a terrible price that they have to pay. They're both having health issues in prison, for example. But right now, the Kremlin seems to want to become more and more repressive at home, in part because they're scared that their own people may rebel.
How should the international community respond to that?
With full-throated condemnation, and that is what is happening now. In Europe, newspapers, media have given a lot of attention to both Navalny and Kara-Murza cases. Certainly that's the case in the United States. Members of Congress speak out. So it's important that these people not be forgotten, that governments and NGOs and media abroad speak up for them.
Does Vladimir Putin care about members of Congress speaking out, though? Because he clearly has an agenda here.
Yes, no, he may not care a whole lot, but members of Congress pass sanctions, and a lot of the sanctions are really beginning to dig deeper now into the Russian economy. And also members of Congress approve funds for arming Ukraine. So Putin probably does care to some extent.
He, of course, cares a lot about the dissent within the country being silenced. Is there anything the Russian civil society can do to work against this crackdown?
Probably not since Putin has taken power have there been so many stresses on the Kremlin. One of those, oddly enough, is the ultranationalists, the hardliners, have been quite critical of Russian military performance in Ukraine. And now, in a very unusual circumstance, a citizen, a guy named Prigozhin, has created a private army with Kremlin support. And for a government to remain in power, having private armies outside full control of the government is a sign of weakness. And so it is possible now that the Kremlin is more worried about how long it's going to be able to sustain itself at a time when military setbacks in Ukraine have been very embarrassing for Russia, and the economic standards of living of people are continuing to go down because of sanctions and poor economic performance.
Yeah, what the Kremlin is trying to do most of all is to symbolize strength here, right? How do you expect that to play out in the coming weeks, months, years?
Part of that will depend on the success or lack of it of Ukrainian counteroffensives, which are going to take place this year. The Ukrainians have a lot of momentum on the battlefield. Russia just attempted an offensive in the last couple of months, and it sputtered and pretty much failed. So that's been pretty embarrassing, and it's caused more hardline criticism of the Kremlin. It's difficult, though, to predict how these things come out. Over the past year or so, there have been a number of predictions about the war in Ukraine, in the West, and a lot of those predictions have not turned out so well. So we should follow events there, but let's be prudent about making predictions.
That was William Courtney of the RAND Corporation. Thank you so much for your time.
You're quite welcome.